Ida for refusing to attend therapy with my family so I can try to have a good relationship with my half-sister? When I was 8 years old, my world shifted in a way I couldn't fully comprehend at the time. My dad, who I saw as the steady and unshakable anchor of our little family, discovered something that would ripple through all of our lives. He found out he had a daughter, a 10-year-old girl from a relationship before he met my mom. There was no betrayal, no tangled web of deceit or infidelity. The story was as straightforward as it was complicated. My dad had been in a serious relationship with her mother, but they broke up and went their separate ways. Shortly after, her mom moved back to her hometown without telling my dad she was pregnant. Life carried on. My dad met my mom, they fell in love quickly, and I came into the picture not long after. For 8 years, it was just us, a tight, loving trio. But then, out of the blue, my dad's ex resurfaced with news that must have felt like a punch to the gut. Their daughter, now curious about her biological father, had started asking questions. That curiosity set off a chain reaction that led to a DNA test confirming what we all now know: my dad had another child. I can only imagine how my dad felt in those early days. The joy of discovering another child must have been tempered by the heartbreak of realizing he'd missed a decade of her life. He met her, spent time getting to know her, and then, naturally, he wanted to introduce her to the rest of us. For him, it was about bringing his worlds together, trying to stitch the fragmented pieces of his life into a cohesive whole. When I first met her, I didn't know what to think. She was a stranger with a connection to my dad that predated even my own existence. I remember the awkwardness, the way the air felt thick and heavy with unspoken emotions. She was jealous of me, that much was immediately clear. To her, I was the embodiment of everything she felt she'd missed out on: a stable, loving relationship with our dad, the security of growing up in the same household, and the knowledge that I had been there for all the milestones she never got to share with him. Her jealousy manifested as resentment, and that resentment turned into hostility. She hated me, and she didn't try to hide it. She treated me like I was the villain in her story, the reason her life hadn't turned out the way she wished it had. Over and over, she told me how much she didn't want a brother, how she wished things could go back to the way they were before she even knew I existed. At first, I was hurt. I didn't understand why she couldn't see that I hadn't asked for any of this either. I didn't choose to have a sibling, let alone one who seemed to despise me. But as time went on, her constant negativity wore me down. I stopped caring about her opinion of me. If anything, I was relieved when she left after her visits. The tension evaporated, and I could go back to the life I knew, a life where I didn't have to deal with her biting comments or her lingering glares. Looking back, I can see that her feelings were rooted in pain. She was grappling with a sense of abandonment, trying to process the fact that her father had built a life without her. I get it, I really do. But at 8 years old, I wasn't equipped to navigate her emotional minefield. I was just a kid, thrust into a situation I didn't understand and couldn't control. And the truth is, I didn't want to deal with it. I was tired of the drama, tired of feeling like I had to walk on eggshells in my own home. I'd have been perfectly happy if she never came back. That might sound harsh, but it's the truth. For me, her presence was a disruption, an unwelcome intrusion into the life I'd grown accustomed to. My dad, of course, was caught in the middle. He wanted so badly for us to be a family, for my half-sister to feel like she belonged. He hoped that over time, things would get better, that we'd find a way to connect, to bond, to forge some kind of sibling relationship. But the reality was far messy. My half-sister didn't want to be part of our family, at least not in the way my dad envisioned. She wanted him, and only him. She resented my mom for taking the place she believed her own mother should have had. She resented me for being the child who got everything she felt she'd been denied. As the years went by, her visits became less frequent. The atmosphere at home grew lighter, freer. Without her around, there was no tension, no undercurrent of resentment simmering just beneath the surface. I didn't miss her when she wasn't there. If anything, I was relieved. I knew my dad was disappointed, though he never said so outright. He tried to hide it, but I could see the sadness in his eyes, hear it in the way his voice softened whenever her name came up. He wanted so badly for things to be different, but he couldn't force us to feel something we didn't. By the time I was 11, my half-sister made the decision to stop coming to our house altogether. She told my dad she didn't want a relationship with me or my mom, and that was that. For her, it was a clean break, a way to maintain a connection with my dad without having to deal with the rest of us. My dad was upset, of course. He tried to convince her to reconsider, but she was firm in her decision. And so, their relationship shifted. They met outside our home, spending time together without me or my mom. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to keep her in his life. For me, her absence was a relief. It felt like a weight had been lifted, like I could finally breathe again. I didn't have to deal with her hostility or her thinly veiled contempt. I could go back to being an only child, at least in practice if not in name. And honestly, I was okay with that. My life felt simpler, less complicated. I didn't hate her, but I didn't miss her either. She was a stranger who had briefly been a part of my world, and now she was gone. And that was fine by me. 3 years ago, when my half-sister finally made the decision to stop coming to our house, it felt like the last thread tying us together had been severed. I remember the conversation my dad had with her. Although I wasn't privy to the details, the aftermath was clear. She had told him outright that she didn't want a relationship with me or my mom. It was a definitive statement, one that left little room for negotiation. My dad was devastated. He tried to reason with her, to explain that family wasn't something you could just pick and choose. But she remained steadfast in her decision. She wanted him and only him, and she didn't see why that should be a problem. I remember how quiet the house felt after that. My dad carried the weight of her absence like an invisible burden. He didn't talk about it much, but you could see it in his eyes, in the way his shoulders seemed to slump just a little more after every phone call with her. Despite her decision to cut ties with me and my mom, my dad refused to give up on her. He continued their relationship outside of our home, meeting her for lunch or spending time with her on weekends. He didn't want to lose her entirely, and he was willing to compromise, even if it hurt him to do so. For the next 3 years, this became the new normal. My dad would go to her, bringing pieces of his life to share with her, while leaving the rest of us behind. He never let it interfere with our family, but the divide was always there, like an unspoken truth we all had to live with. I knew it pained him to juggle 2 worlds, to try and keep everyone happy while knowing deep down that he was failing to truly bridge the gap. My half-sister turned 19 recently, and something seemed to shift. Maybe it was the passage of time, or maybe she started to realize the limits of the relationship she'd created with my dad. They'd been having more serious conversations, ones that left my dad looking even more weighed down than before. Finally, during one of their talks, my dad laid everything out for her. He told her that the relationship they had couldn't continue in the way she wanted. He explained that while he loved her deeply and wanted her in his life, he couldn't build their relationship on the exclusion of me and my mom. He wasn't willing to abandon us every holiday just to spend time with her, nor was he going to celebrate his milestones and achievements without his family present. It was a hard conversation, one that left my dad visibly drained. He told me and my mom about it afterward, and I could tell how much it had cost him to set those boundaries. For so long, he had tried to keep the peace, to keep his relationship with her separate from the rest of us. But he realized that by doing so, he was enabling the very dynamic that had caused so much pain in the first place. My half-sister, to her credit, didn't lash out or storm off. She took some time to think about what my dad had said. Weeks went by, and during that time, she and my dad continued to talk, though the tone of their conversations seemed more subdued. My dad was hopeful, but he didn't push her. He wanted her to come to her own decision, to make the choice to try and mend the fractured relationships on her own terms. Eventually, she came back to him with an answer. She told him she wanted to try to make things work. She didn't know how, but she was willing to make the effort. It was a step forward, albeit a tentative one. My dad was cautiously optimistic, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes. He and my mom discussed the best way to move forward, and they decided that family therapy might be the most constructive path. My half-sister agreed to it, which was a surprise in itself. She wasn't one to open up easily, especially about something as emotionally charged as this. When my parents brought the idea to me, I didn't know how to feel. On the one hand, I could see how much it meant to my dad. He was desperate for this to work, for us to finally come together as a family. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore how I felt about my half-sister. To me, she wasn't really a sister. She was a stranger who had bullied me when we were kids, who had made it clear time and time again that she didn't want me in her life. How was I supposed to reconcile that with the idea of sitting in a room and trying to forge some kind of bond with her? I told my parents no. The words came out quickly, almost instinctively. My dad looked crushed, his face falling in a way that made me feel an immediate pang of guilt. He asked me why, and I tried to explain. I told him that I didn't love her like a sibling. I didn't feel that connection, and I didn't think I ever could. She came into my life when I was 8 years old, and from the very beginning, she made it clear that she didn't want me around. I never had the chance to bond with her, and over time, I stopped wanting to. I told him that I understood she was his daughter too and that I didn't want to stand in the way of their relationship. But I couldn't pretend to care about her the way he did. My dad said he understood, but I could see how much my answer had hurt him. Later that night, I overheard my parents talking. My dad was saying how sad it was that things had ended up this way. He blamed himself, though my mom reassured him that he had done everything he could. He didn't blame me, but I could tell he wished things were different. A part of me wondered if I should try for his sake. I knew how much it meant to him, how much he wanted us to be a family. But every time I thought about it, I came back to the same question: was it worth it? Could I really force myself to build a relationship with someone who had spent years pushing me away? And even if I tried, would it make a difference? Would she truly want to connect with me, or would it just be another obligation, another box to check off to appease our dad? In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on the past. I thought about all the times she had made me feel small, like an outsider in my own home. I thought about the years of silence, the deliberate distance she had placed between us. And I thought about my dad, about the love he had for both of us and the pain he carried because we couldn't find a way to come together. It was a mess, a tangled web of emotions that I wasn't sure how to navigate. In the end, I decided to take things one step at a time. I told my dad that while I wasn't ready for family therapy, I was open to the idea of spending time with her in a more casual setting. I didn't want to jump into something as intense as therapy, but I was willing to give her a chance on my terms. My dad seemed relieved, even if it wasn't the solution he had hoped for. It was a start, and for now, that was enough. She had considered it for a while, probably weighing the years of bitterness and resentment against the faint hope that something might finally be salvaged. When she told my dad she wanted to try and make things work, I think he felt a spark of optimism he hadn't dared allow himself to feel in a long time. For years, he'd carried the heartbreak of our fractured family, and now, at last, it seemed like there might be a way forward. But she didn't know how to go about it. That much was clear. She didn't have a plan, just a vague intention to try. It was as though she'd taken a step toward us but was still hesitant, unsure of where her foot might land. My parents discussed it at length, trying to find the right way to approach the situation. My dad, ever the peacemaker, suggested family therapy as a structured way to navigate the minefield of emotions and history that separated us. He hoped it could be a space where we could express ourselves honestly, with a mediator to guide us through the mess. To his surprise, my half-sister agreed. Maybe she recognized that she needed help in understanding her feelings, or maybe she was just desperate for a connection with my dad and willing to do whatever it took to preserve that bond. Either way, it was a step forward. Then came the conversation with me. I could see the hope in my dad's eyes as he and my mom sat me down to talk. He explained the plan, his voice steady but tinged with a nervous edge, as though he were trying not to push too hard, not to scare me off. He told me that this could be an opportunity for us to rebuild, to start fresh, and to finally have the kind of relationship he'd always dreamed of for us. And then he asked the question that had clearly been weighing on his heart, "Don't you want to have a good relationship with your sister?" The question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. My mom's eyes were on me, searching my face for any sign of willingness, while my dad's hope flickered like a fragile candle. But deep down, I knew my answer. It wasn't even something I needed to think about. The words came out quickly, firmly, and without hesitation. No. I watched as my dad's face fell, the light in his eyes dimming. He tried to hide his disappointment, but I could see it in the subtle droop of his shoulders, in the way his hands fidgeted in his lap. My mom remained calm, gently probing for more. "How do you feel about all this?" she asked. And so, I told them. I told them the truth, raw and unfiltered. I explained that I didn't see her as a real sister. She came into my life when I was 8 years old, a stranger filled with anger and jealousy, and she made it abundantly clear that she wanted nothing to do with me. How could I love someone like that? How could I feel a sibling bond with someone who had spent years treating me like an unwelcome intruder in her father's life? I told them that I never bonded with her, never grew to like her. I wasn't harboring any hatred or ill will, I had simply moved on. She had been a disruptive force in my childhood, and when she left, the peace that followed felt like a relief. I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds or forcing a connection that had never existed in the first place. I told my dad that if she did start showing up again, I wouldn't ignore her or treat her badly. I wasn't looking to make things harder than they already were. But I also couldn't imagine us ever being close, like siblings who grow up together or who share a deep familial bond. That wasn't our reality. It never had been, and I didn't see how therapy could change that. I told him that I understood she had been a kid, that she'd gone through her own struggles and had a lot to work through. But understanding her pain didn't mean I had to let it shape my life now. When I finished speaking, the room was silent. My dad looked crushed. He nodded, as if to say he understood, but the disappointment in his eyes was impossible to miss. He didn't argue or try to change my mind. He just sat there, the weight of my words settling over him like a heavy blanket. My mom, ever the mediator, tried to reassure him later that night. I overheard bits of their conversation, how sad he was that things had ended up this way, how much he wished he could fix it, how powerless he felt to bridge the gap between us. My mom told him he wasn't to blame, that he had done everything he could, but I could tell her words offered little comfort. This wasn't about blame, it was about loss. For me, the conversation brought a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I felt a sense of relief for being honest about my feelings. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the guilt of seeing my dad so heartbroken. I knew how much this meant to him, how much he wanted us to be a family. And I couldn't help but wonder, was I being selfish? Could I try, just for his sake? But even as I asked myself those questions, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of resistance deep inside me. I didn't want this. I didn't want to dredge up the past, to sit in a room with her and relieve all the hurt and resentment. I didn't want to force myself into a relationship that felt unnatural, just to make my dad happy. The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension. My dad didn't bring it up again, but I could see the lingering sadness in his demeanor. My mom gave me space, not pushing the issue but clearly hoping I might reconsider. And as for me, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to ease my dad's pain, to give him the hope he so desperately needed. But another part of me felt justified in my decision, steadfast in my belief that this was the right choice for me. After all, wasn't it better to be honest than to go through the motions of something I didn't truly believe in? Still, the doubt lingered. I thought about my half-sister, about the years she spent feeling like an outsider, about the pain that must have driven her to push us away. I wondered if she was really ready to change, if she truly wanted to build a relationship with me, or if this was just another attempt to hold onto my dad. I thought about my own feelings, about the walls I had built around myself to keep her at a distance. Could those walls ever come down? And even if they did, what would be left on the other side? In the end, I realized that there were no easy answers. This wasn't a story with a neat, happy ending, tied up with a bow. It was messy and complicated, filled with pain and longing and the hope for something better. And for now, all I could do was take it one day at a time, navigating the tangled web of emotions as best I could. Whether or not things would ever change, I didn't know. But at least, for the moment, I was being true to myself. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. As the days passed, I couldn't shake the weight of my dad's disappointment. His words haunted me not because they were angry or accusing, but because they were filled with sadness. He didn't blame me. He said as much. But I could see the pain in his eyes, the way he carried the burden of our fractured family, as if every failed connection was somehow his fault. That look stuck with me, echoing in my mind even as I tried to convince myself that I had every right to feel the way I did. Was I an asshole for not wanting to work on things with her? It was a question that lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. The logical part of me said no. I wasn't obligated to repair a relationship that had been broken from the start. I had no control over the circumstances that brought her into my life or the way she treated me when she arrived. I wasn't the one who created this mess, and I wasn't responsible for fixing it. But logic has a funny way of clashing with guilt, and guilt was the emotion that seemed to bubble up most often when I thought about my dad. I tried to push it all aside, to go about my days as if nothing had changed. But it wasn't that simple. The topic came up more often than I expected, my parents discussing therapy options, my dad occasionally dropping subtle hints about giving things a chance, and even my mom cautiously suggesting that I think it over again. None of them were forceful or pushy, but it was clear they were holding on to hope. And that hope felt heavier than any direct confrontation ever could. Meanwhile, I found myself reflecting on the years of distance between my half-sister and me. As much as I wanted to keep my walls up, there were moments when doubt crept in. What if she really had changed? What if her willingness to try was genuine, and I was the one standing in the way of something that could finally be better? What if, by refusing to try, I wasn't just protecting myself but also contributing to the very pain I was trying to avoid? Still, those thoughts didn't erase the memories of her jealousy, her resentment, or the way she had treated me like an intruder in her father's life. I couldn't forget the years of feeling like I had to tiptoe around her emotions, the way her presence turned my home into a battleground of silent hostility. She hadn't just been indifferent to me, she had actively disliked me, and I had done nothing to deserve it. That wound didn't heal just because time had passed. Eventually, my dad asked for a sit-down conversation, just the two of us. It wasn't an ambush, he was calm, gentle, and as understanding as he always was. But I could see the weariness in him, the weight of carrying all of this for so long. He started by thanking me for being honest about my feelings, for being willing to have such a difficult conversation. Then he asked me, not for the first time but with more depth, whether I thought there was any part of me that could try. I felt torn. On the one hand, I wanted to ease his sadness, to see the relief in his eyes and know that I'd given him the one thing he wanted most. But on the other hand, I knew myself well enough to realize that forcing a relationship with her wasn't going to feel authentic. And more importantly, I wasn't sure it would work. So I told him as much. I told him that I didn't hate her and that I didn't want to stand in the way of whatever relationship he wanted to have with her. But I also told him that I didn't think I could ever see her as a real sister. Too much had happened, and too much time had passed. He nodded, and for a moment, I thought that was the end of it. But then he surprised me. He said, "What if you didn't have to see her as a sister? What if it wasn't about pretending to be something you're not but about starting fresh, just two people trying to figure out if they can coexist in the same space?" The idea gave me pause. It wasn't about becoming the picture-perfect family or even about forging a deep bond. It was about trying, in whatever capacity felt possible. The simplicity of it struck a chord. I couldn't promise to feel like her brother, but could I try to treat her like any other person I might meet? Someone I didn't know well but was willing to give a chance to? I told him I'd think about it, and I meant it. Over the next few weeks, I let the idea settle. I tried to imagine what it might look like, what it might feel like, to approach her without the baggage of our shared history weighing us down. And while the thought didn't exactly fill me with excitement, it didn't fill me with dread either. It felt manageable, like something I could do not for her, not even for me, but for my dad. When I finally agreed to give it a try, my dad's relief was palpable. He didn't expect miracles, and neither did I. But we agreed to start small, a casual lunch, the three of us, in a neutral setting. No therapy, no forced discussions about the past, just a chance to see where things stood. That first meeting was awkward, as I expected it to be. She seemed just as uncertain as I was, her usual edge softened by what I could only assume was her own nervousness. We talked about surface-level things: school, work, hobbies. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it also wasn't terrible. For the first time, I saw glimpses of her as a person rather than the jealous, angry figure from my childhood. She was guarded, but there were moments when her walls slipped, and I could see traces of vulnerability beneath. In the weeks that followed, we had a few more casual meetings. Each one felt slightly less strained than the last. I still didn't feel like we were siblings, but I also didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of our history anymore. We weren't close, but we were civil. And for now, that was enough. My dad, meanwhile, seemed lighter. He didn't expect us to magically become best friends, but just knowing we were trying was enough for him. I could see the difference it made in him, and that alone made the effort feel worthwhile. As time went on, I stopped questioning whether I was an asshole for not wanting to work on things with her. The truth was, I wasn't working on it for her, I was working on it for my dad, and maybe a little bit for myself. I didn't know where things would go from here, or whether we'd ever move beyond the tentative truce we'd established. But for the first time, I felt like that was okay. Not every relationship has to be perfect, and not every story has to have a happy ending. Sometimes, it's enough to take a step forward, no matter how small. And for us, that step was a start.